Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for class for Monday, the 28th. So, as you can see in the notes below, paper number one should have been submitted by this point. So, if you have not submitted in paper number one, please let me know. In terms of evaluating paper number one, as I tell my students, everybody is in the queue. So, I grade the papers in the order of receipt. It will probably take me a little bit of time to get to the papers, but I will be returning them certainly before your second paper is due so that you can utilize what you learned in the first paper with your second paper. And as you know, you all have the option of rewriting the first paper after I've evaluated it and I've put my comments on it for grammar and mechanics as well as content. If you're content with your grade, you're done. But if you would like to improve your grade, you can take my comments into account. And if you need additional direction, you could certainly meet with me. And then ultimately, I ask that you submit in 2 copies of that paper, the original version with my commentary on it, along with your revision, of course, via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And you would get the higher of the 2 grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester to submit in that revision. But the sooner the better for everybody involved. So, as I am working through those papers, I do want to remind you that we now have registration going on, and the class schedule is live, which you can find on the GCC website. Notes below. You can see section 2 about registration, both for intersession and spring classes. If you've never taken intersession classes, that's the period of time between the fall and the spring semester when we normally go on break. It's about 3.5 weeks or so in January, and it's a highly condensed academic semester. So basically, what you would normally do in 16 weeks, you do over 3 weeks. So again, it's highly condensed. It's not for everyone, and we offer a limited number of courses in that format. We used to mostly offer them as face-to-face courses. Now, after COVID, we offer them mostly as online classes. And that said, I will be teaching over the intersession a PCS 101 class. Right now it says staff, but that should be the class that I'm teaching. And in terms of that particular course, I think it actually lends itself pretty well, public speaking it is, to this format of a condensed class because public speaking doesn't have the kind of reading or the need for writing time and revision that you might find in, let's say, an English class. But I can certainly let you know more about that. We also offer, of course, spring classes, and my suspicion is that you may have fulfilled your requirements for English classes. And even if you have, you might be interested to know that we offer a degree option in English, liberal arts option in English if you were to take 6 200 level classes, and obviously this class would count as one. And it's very similar to the liberal arts general. That's done deliberately. It's mostly the electives in the liberal arts general. So if it turns out that you changed your mind along the way, you could just switch back to the liberal arts general. And I happen to be the program advisor for that, but you could talk to anybody in the English faculty. And next semester, what I will be teaching as an English class, very similar to this format, is a Shakespeare course. So, moving on, we know that we are talking about Dracula, even though our course outline says we're talking about Halloween, but it makes a lot more sense to talk about Halloween during our Wednesday class than it does in our Monday class because Halloween is this upcoming Thursday. So I'm just going to flip things around a little bit. Where we left off was talking a little bit about the iconic 1930s version of Bela Lugosi's Dracula and how that perhaps brought Dracula to the masses and that the film is different, of course, from the text, which is something that we've seen previously in class with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and also with Frankenstein, but that doesn't negate the importance of film. Perhaps the film Dracula is more like the text than Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Certainly, the mode of narration is different in the film, in that it's not easy to put an epistolary novel in film format. So we're not really getting the newspaper clippings and the journal entries and the diary entries and the letters that we would during the actual novel itself. And the novel is quite long. And that said, the film has done some good amount of condensing, whether it be condensing characters or condensing plot. Um, the ending of Dracula seems quite hurried, in my opinion. It's much more detailed and drawn out and different, and not surprisingly so, in the novel. And the novel introduces us to characters that we would never be introduced to in the film. That said, I think you still get a good sense of what the Dracula text is about through watching the film. And believe it or not, the Dracula text is actually longer, in that there was a deleted introduction that was deleted because of length in the novel. It's called Dracula's Guest. And if you were to look in the notes below, you can see that I have included a link for that. In the event that you wanted to read it, it oftentimes appears as a short story because it can stand alone, and it helps to establish the mood and the atmosphere. And what perhaps is so surprising to many readers of Dracula is how little time really is devoted to Dracula's story, which is, of course, expanded through Dracula's Guest. But really, the story is really about the vampire hunters rather than the vampire himself. So there are contemporary authors, Anne Rice comes to mind, who've taken great advantage of that by giving us the Dracula story. And I had suggested that you might want to think about the novel as different stories in and of themselves, so that it might be easier to read and also digest. And I think it was also clever from Bram Stoker's perspective to do that, because he could appeal to a lot of different audience members. And I know you might be in different places with your reading right now, so I just generally wanted to draw your attention to a few things that you should be paying attention to. And then, of course, we have our Halloween class. There's nothing that really you have to do to prepare except to come. You know that I had ordered quite a few texts for this class, and one of the texts was a Dover paperback about ghost stories. So I can give you a little bit of a hint about next class that has something to do with that Dover paperback, but you're not required to read anything per se. So I hope it amuses and entertains you, my Halloween class. Do look as you are going through the novel in terms of the way that the old world, Romania and Dracula, is presented as compared to the quote new world, the modern world, represented by all of the other characters. Um, Things like the West are supposed to represent civilization, things that are rational, scientific, as opposed to the East, which is the exact opposite: uncivilized, irrational, and filled with superstition. We get that right from the very beginning with little hints such as the trains don't run on time, for instance, one of the things that Jonathan Harker observes when he's going to visit Dracula for a real estate deal. One of the ways that the film is different from the novel is that Renfield and is collapsed into the Harker character, who is the real estate agent. Um, think about things like shorthand when it is mentioned in the novel. That would be the epitome of technology at the time. It would be comparable to our internet or artificial intelligence. Jonathan Harker's name, I don't think is any mistake, because to hark to call out, to listen. And this is something that we're going to hear because it's his tale. Um, and the idea that foreigner is presented as evil, alien, xenophobia is something that we have talked about in some of the other texts. It, I think, is no mistake. In the movie version of Dracula, you might have noticed the pendant that he was wearing. This is something that I talk about in my horror film class, which actually I will be offering in the spring semester, by the way. Right now it's listed as staff. That's a CMN 201 class if you are interested in horror film. And I usually offer that class online in the fall, which is what I'm doing now, and in person in the spring. So that would be offered on Thursday evening if you are interested in that class. And I can certainly tell you more about it. One of the things I talk about in that class is the film Dracula, which is considered to be the first American horror film, the first being The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, as I had mentioned last class. And you might have noticed in watching Dracula that pendant that he's wearing that some have likened to a kind of Star of David, and the possibility of anti-Semitic messages in that particular film. There will be lots of references to eating and appetite in the novel Dracula. In the very first page, we get a dinner reference, and this is not coincidental. The idea that Dracula himself has this appetite that can't be satiated, and that also leads to a lot of thematic possibilities. And we are told that May 4th, St. George's Day, is when evil things hold sway. So there's lots of references to pagan holidays and pagan celebrations within the text. I think I'd mentioned that there is a website, which I will be sharing with you after Halloween, where you can get a daily um, post from Dracula so that you can read Dracula in real time over the course of a year. That wouldn't necessarily be that helpful for us in an academic semester, but it is an awfully fun way to experience Dracula, much like the characters would have experienced what was going on. Expect lots of gothic atmosphere. In fact, Dracula is most famous perhaps for establishing what we expect with gothic atmosphere. And it's no mistake that the castle we're told about in chapter 2 has no bell or knocker. The idea of isolation is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. And the castle is on the edge of a precipice, which is something that Jonathan will also find himself experiencing, literally as well as figuratively. It's nighttime, it's Transylvania, and Dracula has acquired a library of English books. He's buying British real estate. One of the most common ways of reading and watching Dracula is a fear of immigration, that the other is going to come to Britain and basically corrupt its civilized civilization, especially through the corruption of its female. And notice how often Dracula's victims are female. So in chapter 3, we get Jonathan's imprisonment and some highly charged language that would be quite sexual for the time. We talked about the Victorian period in reference to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and how repressive it was. On page 46, for instance, when Jonathan is being attacked or on the verge of being attacked by 3 female vampires. Note the significance of the number 3, representational of Christian Trinity. But the sense that Stephen King even talks about it, that what we're getting is an erotic episode, and that Jonathan is completely helpless at this point, so he can't be blamed because ultimately he is the one that is being attacked, so to speak. Chapter 4, note that at one point the Count dresses in Jonathan's clothes when he goes off to mail letters and so forth from Jonathan. And of course, this is the idea of Count Dracula trying to take over the English, or literally Jonathan's identity. And we end with a cliffhanger, which is quite clever, I think. And that is our first book before we shift into the romance elements of Dracula. And we're told about ultimately Lucy and Mina and their quarters, and their shift from journals and to letters now at this particular point when Lucy and Mina are both talking about their romantic relationships. Um, and Mina is presented very much as a modern woman. She knows stenography and shorthand and uses a typewriter. However, she does want to be useful to Jonathan. The idea that she knows her place in society. Gender is a very interesting theme in this particular novel, that she doesn't want to usurp Jonathan's position. Unlike Lucy, who is a much more modern woman in the sense that she has three suitors. Notice number three again. Three is quite symbolic in this novel. She has three suitors and is contemplating having all three. Now, yes, in some ways she's the stereotypical female of the time that's concerned only with romance rather than profession, unlike Mina. But in other ways, Lucy really breaks the stereotypes. And that said, one could even say that she is rather loose, hence her name Lucy, as she contemplates three marriage proposals, bemoans the fact that she can't accept all three, and a little bit of a spoiler alert here, she is the character who is initially killed in Dracula, and we've seen this trope over and over again in horror film, where it's the sexually promiscuous or experienced female who is killed off, and it's the virginal one who lives at the very end. We're introduced to Quincy Morris, which is something that we don't see in the film version. And he is a Texan. He's from the United States. So he represents a foreigner. And there also is this threat about Americans taking over Britain, which you will see as you continue reading on in the novel. My suspicion is that you probably haven't finished it yet. So it's, I think, a nice happy coincidence that our Halloween class happens to fall when you're reading Dracula, not only for establishing mood, but also for giving you a little bit of time for the longest novel. We get a Dr. Seward, who's supposed to represent the professional aspects of society, science, if you will. Arthur Holmeswood, who represents the aristocracy. And it's perhaps not too surprising that Lucy decides to choose Arthur Holmeswood for her mate. And Renfield, he's the insane patient asylum trope. The idea that you have somebody who's on the brink of insanity is something that you particularly see with horror film. But we've also talked about this with things like Frankenstein. How much can we trust our narrators? We talked about this with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, about losing control of oneself through outside substance. We talked about this with Poe's narrators. Perhaps that's one of the greatest fears, is being insane and not knowing that one is insane. Expect some humor in this novel that you wouldn't necessarily assume that you would find. Lots of punning. For instance, when you have the character saying that you can count on them. Count for Count Dracula. When we get to chapter 6, Lucy, by this point, has been visiting the grave of a suicide. Now, this means that this grave is unholy land. It can't be consecrated because it's the grave of a suicide. So we've got all of these little hints about what would allow Dracula, who is now moved from Transylvania to Britain, to be able to approach characters such as Lucy. Renfield is consuming insects. Again, notice the idea of consumption. Renfield is kind of a junior vampire, if you want to think about it. Renfield is consuming life forces for their energy, and it's something that Dracula is doing as well. Notice how Renfield moves up the food chain, beginning with insects and then moving to small mammals. In chapter 7, we're told about a Victorian scrapbook, which was very common at the time. I guess you could think about it as somewhat similar to our social media, where people would post things that would be important to them. And this is where we learn about Dracula's ship arriving, the Demeter. It's one of my favorite scenes in the novel. I'm always creeped out by the idea that the ship captain is losing ship members in the night and ultimately ties his hands with the rosary beads on the ship's wheel, and ultimately he too will perish. In chapter 8, we're told about more things with appetites, specifically in relation to women's appetites, and they should be able to see their partner asleep before engagement, which would be considered rather radical. The idea that a relationship wasn't consummated until after marriage. Um, Things like saying, well, you don't count now. Again, the idea of the punning with the count. And when we're introduced to Van Helsing, this will be in chapter 9. This is where we get the merging of the science that's represented, for instance, with Dr. Seward, and religion. And Van Helsing is quite interesting because he can merge science and superstition at the same time. We get this long convoluted story about how Van Helsing is going to be introduced, and that he knew Dr. Seward, and he once actually Dr. Seward sucked the poison from Van Helsing's wound. Notice all the references to sucking, which could be erotic, and it certainly is important in terms of supernatural transformation. In chapters 10 through 12, as Lucy becomes more and more ill, as she is succumbing to the vampire's bite, Dracula's bite, all of the men give her blood transfusions. I know we're going to have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here for anybody who knows their science. We don't even know if all of these blood types will match. We have to assume they will. This is oftentimes viewed as a symbol or a metaphor for sexual relations, about the exchange of bodily fluids. 3 men giving their bodily fluids to Lucy. Again, perhaps one of the reasons why her character is killed off. There will be foreshadowing in here. Keep in mind that the reader might not necessarily have known all of the vampire lore that we take as common knowledge. In fact, the text helped to bring this vampire lore to us as common knowledge. So Quincy talks about how he shot a vampire bat. This is a little bit of foreshadowing for events that will occur later on, and the way the vampire bat is somewhat similar to Dracula, and that Dracula can transform into a bat. We will get Lucy's, and it is in quotation marks, in chapter 13, death, quote unquote, because she will die, but she will arise as a vampire, spoiler alert here, and have to be killed again. Just to give you an idea how repressive Victorian society was, I find chapter 13 absolutely fascinating. When Mina is talking about how she's holding her husband's arm, Jonathan's arm, in public, and how risque that is. So that gives you an idea, again, what would be considered risque during this time. It helps put into context some of the scenes about the vampire bites and the killing of vampires, which is quite erotic. Seward at one point says in chapter 13, if America keeps breeding men like Quincy, it will be a world power. I think embedded within there is a little bit of xenophobia, not about Transylvania, but about America from the British perspective, about what kind of a threat America could and ultimately did become. Van Helsing in chapter 14 talks about his lonely life, and we always know that isolation is a bad thing. So one of the good things about this is that Van Helsing is able to join community. And notice that when the characters work as community, they are able to be effective. It's when the characters separate or they're isolated that they're not effective. And I'll end with chapter 15 and 16, and I realize you might have gone beyond that, or you might not have necessarily gotten to that place yet. This is where all of the men basically have to confront the vampiric Lucy, and she is staked. In that episode where she's staked by Arthur is also quite erotic, something that Stephen King talked about in Danse Macabre, if you remember from the beginning of the semester. So today's attendance question, which will be due on Wednesday the 30th, and certainly if you need additional time, please let me know. And you're not required to respond to your peers, as you know, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That based on how much or how little you've read the text Dracula, do you like it or dislike it thus far, and why? Obviously, no right or wrong answer. It's just our way of sort of getting into the text itself. Next class, we will have our Halloween class, and then we will continue on with Dracula. So this is a good time for you to keep reading Dracula as, of course, Halloween approaches. So again, done deliberately, so that you can enjoy the atmosphere of Halloween. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Halloween. Take care. Bye bye.